Hello, and welcome to this Pali Studies tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at pronouns, especially personal pronouns. So, what is a pronoun? Well, pronouns are words which can be substituted for substantive nouns. That's places, people, things, or ideas. They're words like you, me, he, she, it. If we look at the pair of sentences, the boy sees the monk, he goes to him, the words he and him are both pronouns, whereas adjectives describe nouns, pronouns simply substitute for them. So here we can see that he points back to the boy and him points back to the monk. And that's often the case with pronouns. They often refer back to something or someone else previously mentioned. Now in English, there are many different types of pronoun. There are personal pronouns like the ones we've just looked at, and words like I, you, he, she, it. And there are possessive pronouns, words like mine, yours, his and hers. There are reflexive pronouns, myself, yourself, himself, and these reflect back on the subject. There are demonstrative pronouns, words like this and that, these and those, and there are indefinite pronouns, which are words like everyone, someone or anyone. There are interrogative pronouns, which start questions, words like who, whose, what and which. And finally, there are relative pronouns. In English, they're the same words as the interrogative pronouns, but they are used differently in sentences like the house which Jack built. Now today in this video, we're just going to look at personal pronouns. Now it's sometimes said that personal pronouns are so called because they refer to people, which of course they do, but personal pronouns don't always refer just to people. They can also refer to objects and animals and even ideas. In fact, they can be used to replace any substantive noun. Here, personal means grammatical person, as in they take first, second or third person like verbs do. We've covered grammatical person in a previous video. If you remember, the first person refers to the person who's actually speaking. The second person is the person spoken to, and the third person is anything else. If you're a native English speaker, you probably switch unconsciously between the different types without knowing their different uses. For instance, as well as grammatical person, personal pronouns take two forms, that is, a subjective form and an objective form. We use the subject form when the pronoun replaces the subject of the verb, and you've guessed it, we use the objective form when the pronoun replaces the object of the verb. Now we know that there's usually only one subject of a sentence, but there can be many different types of object. For instance, there are direct objects, indirect objects, and prepositional objects. And the object form of the pronoun is used to replace all these different types of object. So now let's look at an example. The boy sees the monk talking to the girl. In this sentence, there are three substantive nouns: the boy, the monk, and the girl. The boy is the subject, and the monk is the direct object, and the girl, because of the preposition to, is a prepositional object. So if we replace these nouns with pronouns, first the boy takes the subject form, the monk takes an object form, and the girl also takes an object form. And so we get the sentence, he sees him talking to her. Now notice that each pronoun refers back to a different substantive noun, and this is sometimes called the antecedent noun. This will be more important when we look at relative pronouns, but for now it's just important to remember that pronouns refer back to their antecedent. Okay, So let's look at all the personal pronouns in English. The first thing to notice is that the first and second person forms are genderless. That means there aren't separate forms for male, female and neuter, whereas the third person has different forms for male, female and other things. In the plural, the third person all has the same form, they or them. Hopefully you're familiar with the English personal pronouns, but you may not have seen them written down in this way. Now, the good news is that personal pronouns in Pali have similar characteristics to those in English, so we can fill out the same table, but with the Pali personal pronouns. Again, the first and the second person are genderless, whereas the third person has male, female and neuter forms. And, unlike English, this is true of the plural as well. And it should come as no surprise that in Pali, the subject and the object of the verb is identified by case. So the subject pronouns are in nominative case, whereas the object pronouns are in accusative case. Well, that's true for direct objects, but of course prepositional objects in Pali will be in the prepositional cases. But first, before we go on to them, let's look at an example. If we wanted to create the sentence, she sees him, we'd have to use the third person pronouns. So referring back to our table, for the subject she, we use the nominative form, which is sa, and the verb sees must also take the third person ending, which is pasati, so that it matches the subject, and the object takes the masculine third person in accusative, which is tang. One thing to note is, if we were to translate the Pali sentence back into English, we could render it either as she sees him, or she sees her, it, or even you, because tang can mean all of these things. And we'd have to look at the context of the sentence to figure out which one of these translations was correct. Now, in Pali, personal pronouns aren't as important as they are in English, where all verbs must have an expressed subject. In Pali, as we've seen in an earlier video, the subject doesn't always have to be expressed in every sentence. So, with Pali verbs, we can see from the endings whether they're in first, second or third person, which means we can see who is doing the action. I see, you see, or he, she and it sees. So in Pali, our example, she sees him, would more often be expressed just as tang pasati, because the ending of the verb expresses the third person singular, and so it implies he, she or it as the subject. Of course, we'd have to guess from context whether a male, female or neuter subject was being referred to. Well, that's the subject and direct object forms, but what about prepositional objects? Well, here's a table of the prepositional case declensions for pronouns in Pali. I've skipped the genitive case because we'll see that when we cover possessive pronouns. Now remember, when we're rendering these terms into English, we must use the English object forms of the pronouns me, you, him, her and it, as well as the prepositions from the cases. Now we can see that pronouns in Pali have many forms and they're quite irregular. This is true of the plural too. But we needn't worry too much about these, as we can always look them up. What's important is knowing how to use them. So let's take another example. He discusses the Dharma with me. So if we were to write this in Pali, we'd take the subject form of the third person pronoun he, which is so, and the verb discusses is mantati, taking the third person singular ending to match the subject, the direct object is Damanang, taking the accusative case, and finally the object pronoun me in first person would be placed in instrumental case because of the preposition with. Well, that's a very quick run through of personal pronouns. Okay, so let's recap. Pronouns are substitutes for substantive nouns. They're called personal because they take one of three grammatical persons, that is, first, second or third person, like verbs. They take the same number and gender, if in third person, as the nouns which they are substituting. And this replaced noun is called the antecedent. Also, although they're very irregular, they take cases which identifies the role that they play as if they were a noun. Now don't be too worried about all the different forms of the pronouns. To help you, I've created a spreadsheet which contains all the different Pali pronouns. You will find this on my blog, which is palistudies.blogspot.com. Here, search for the post Pali pronouns, and on here you'll find a link to a file that you can download. This file contains the tables that we've just looked at, as well as an A to Z list of all the pronouns in Pali. Well, thank you for watching.